The world never truly knew him. Cameras almost never showed him. His name never made the headlines. He never lifted trophies or scored goals. Yet a single decision he made changed the course of football history forever. Today, billions of people live with the result of that decision, but almost no one knows the man behind it. So who was this man? Why, despite being one of the most important figures behind one of football's greatest stories, is his name almost never mentioned? That man was Jorge Messi, the father of Lionel Messi. This is not the story of trophies. This is not the story of goals. This is the story of a father, and perhaps one of the most important stories in football that has never truly been told. Born in the late 1950s in Rosario, Argentina, Jorge Horacio Messi came from an ordinary family and believed he would live an ordinary life. He wasn't born into wealth, nor did he have powerful connections in the world of football. His life was no different from that of millions of Argentinians, working, providing for his family, and trying to build a better future for his children. But years later, everything was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. He just didn't know it yet. Back then, Jorge Messi's greatest dream was simply to have an honest job that would allow him to provide for his family. That is why, at a young age, he began working at the Acindar steel factory in Rosario. It was far from an easy job. Long shifts, deafening noise, intense heat, and the same exhausting routine day after day. For many years, this was Jorge Messi's life. But there was one thing no one knew. Amid the roar of that steel factory, the future of world football was quietly beginning to take shape. Neither Jorge Messi knew it, nor his co-workers, nor the people walking the streets of Rosario, because fate was about to place before him a challenge, unlike anything he had ever faced. A challenge that would not only change his own life, but also determine the future of a name that billions of people would one day know. And when that moment finally arrived, the decision Jorge Messi had to make would be anything but easy. He stood before only two difficult choices. Would he choose the safe path as a father, or would he be brave enough to risk everything? Because the answer to that question would change not only his son's future, but the future of world football itself. But to truly understand why that decision carried such enormous weight, we first need to understand the kind of man Jorge Messi was. During his years in Rosario, Jorge Messi's life was not filled with extraordinary events. Going to work in the morning, coming home in the evening, and spending time with his family was simply his daily routine. From the outside, he was no different from thousands of hard-working fathers across Argentina. Neither did newspapers ever mention his name, nor did anyone realize that a story destined to change football history was quietly taking shape. Yet life often begins its greatest transformations not through dramatic events, but through moments that seem completely ordinary. For Jorge Messi, that turning point began with the birth of his fourth child, Lionel Messi. From that moment on, the balance of Jorge Messi's life began to change completely. He was no longer just a factory worker earning a living for himself. He was now a father responsible for the future of 4 children. That is why the long shifts at the steel factory meant more than just exhausting hours of work. Every step he took, every paycheck he earned, and every extra hour he worked became an investment in his children's future. When Lionel was born, he seemed just like his brothers and sister. There was nothing about him that made people believe he possessed an extraordinary gift. Neither his teachers believed he would one day become a world-class athlete, nor did the people around him imagine that this little boy would one day be remembered as one of the greatest footballers in history. Even Jorge Messi himself had no idea that the journey which would completely transform his family's life had already begun. Before long, however, his youngest son's unusual passion for football began to reveal itself. And Jorge Messi, who until then had simply been an ordinary father trying to provide for his family, was about to step into a responsibility he had never expected. Now I want to ask you a question. What do you think a father truly feels the first time he realizes his son has a special talent? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because there are millions of parents who recognize their child's talent but have no idea what they should do next. Your perspective might inspire someone else. When Jorge Messi first noticed his youngest son's love for football, he didn't see it as extraordinary talent. He saw it as nothing more than a childhood passion. After all, Lionel wasn't the only child playing football on the streets of Rosario. Nearly every child in the neighborhood spent most of the day chasing a football. So what made his youngest son different? The answer to that question slowly began to capture Jorge Messi's attention. Even at a very young age, whenever the ball reached his feet, everyone around him would stop for a few moments just to watch. It wasn't only the proud gaze of a father. Neighbors, friends, and even the coaches working with the local children were beginning to notice the very same thing. The little boy wasn't simply dribbling the ball. It was as if he was having a conversation with it. The ball seemed almost glued to his feet. Of course, no father watches a few neighborhood matches and immediately believes his son will one day reach the very top of world football. Jorge Messi wasn't chasing such a dream either. He was simply a father who wanted to see his son happy. Still, an indescribable feeling had begun to grow inside him. What if he really was different? What if this wasn't just a childhood game? That single thought led Jorge Messi toward a decision he had never expected to make. Instead of simply watching his son from the sidelines, Jorge Messi decided to become part of his development. That is why he began coaching at Grandoli, a small neighborhood club in Rosario. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than ordinary volunteer work. There were no television cameras, no stadiums filled with thousands of fans, no professional clubs, just a dusty field, worn-out jerseys, children who loved football, and a handful of parents cheering for their dreams. No one knew that this tiny club was witnessing the very first steps of someone who would one day become one of the most talked about names in football history. But during those years, Jorge Messi was beginning to realize something else. His son wasn't simply interested in football. With every passing day, he was reading the game differently from the other children. At first, the difference was almost impossible to notice. Maybe it was a clever dribble, maybe the way he touched the ball, or perhaps the way he seemed to understand the game. But as time went on, those small differences became too obvious to ignore. It was at that very moment that a new question began to grow in Jorge Messi's mind. Should he allow his son to live an ordinary childhood? Or should he lead his entire family into a long and uncertain journey? At that moment, he still didn't know the answer, because the greatest obstacle he would soon face would be far bigger than talent itself. This time, the issue wouldn't be football, it would be his son's health. His youngest son was running, playing football, and showing his love for the game more and more each day, just like every other child his age. Meanwhile, Jorge Messi spent most of the free time he had after his long factory shifts watching him play. Perhaps he was exhausted, perhaps he was sleep-deprived, but he never wanted to miss a single moment his son stepped onto the pitch. Everything seemed perfectly normal until time began to pass. The other children were growing. Month after month, they became taller, stronger, and physically more developed. But there was one small detail that caught Jorge's attention. His son wasn't developing at the same pace. At first, he didn't think too much about it. Every child grows differently. That doctor probably wasn't the first person to tell him that. Relatives, neighbors, and friends kept repeating the same words. They encouraged him to wait a little longer and not to worry. Jorge Messi wanted to believe them, because sometimes a father simply refuses to accept that his greatest fear could actually be real. As time passed, his son's talent continued to grow before his eyes, but his body wasn't growing at the same pace. That was why one day, Jorge and his wife Celia decided they could no longer wait. They had to find out the truth. Perhaps the answers would put their minds at ease. Perhaps all of their fears would prove to be unnecessary. But as they walked through the doors of that hospital, neither of them knew that their lives were about to change forever. After completing the examinations and medical tests, the doctors invited the family into the office. What they had to say wasn't very long, but sometimes just a few sentences are enough to change an entire life. The doctors diagnosed their youngest son with growth hormone deficiency. The silence that filled the room at that moment was almost impossible to describe. Dozens of questions rushed through Jorge Messi's mind all at once. Could this condition be treated? Would his son be able to live a normal life? Would he ever be able to continue playing football? But the next sentence the doctor spoke was perhaps even heavier than the diagnosis itself, because there was a treatment for the condition, but that treatment would also mark the beginning of the greatest struggle Jorge Messi would ever face. The doctors diagnosed Lionel Messi with growth hormone deficiency. They explained that treatment was possible. However, they also made it clear that this was far from a simple course of medication. The treatment had to be administered regularly and could continue for years. Most importantly, it was extremely expensive. The moment Jorge Messi heard the numbers coming from the doctor's mouth, he fell into complete silence. For years, he had worked at the steel factory. Early morning shifts, endless overtime, and countless hours of hard physical labor. Yet despite all of that, his income was only enough to cover his family's basic needs. Now an entirely different reality stood before him. His son's future depended not only on his extraordinary talent, but also on whether the family could afford the treatment. As Jorge Messi walked out of the hospital that day, only one question echoed through his mind. What does a father do when he discovers that his child's future depends on money? Jorge Messi had no answer to that question, because none of the choices in front of him were truly good. Give up on the treatment, try to somehow pay medical bills that seemed almost impossible to afford, or find a football club that would recognize his son's talent and be willing to support him. From that moment on, Jorge Messi's life was no longer the life of an ordinary factory worker. Every morning, he was no longer going to work simply to earn a paycheck. Every step he took, every conversation he had, and every hope he held on to had only one purpose: to give his son a chance. But there was one thing Jorge Messi still didn't know. The first doors he knocked on would not open as easily as he expected. In fact, some of them would close before he had even finished speaking. So which club did he turn to first? This was where Jorge Messi's real battle truly began. His mission was no longer just to help his son develop as a footballer. His first priority was to find a club that could both cover the cost of the treatment and give his son the opportunity to play football. But he would soon discover that achieving that goal would be far more difficult than he had imagined. At first, he placed his hopes in Argentina's biggest football clubs. He believed that his son's remarkable talent would, at the very least, attract the attention of one of them. If the right people watched him play, perhaps they would also be willing to help with the cost of his treatment. And whenever the young boy stepped onto the pitch, he truly did capture people's attention. Every time the ball reached his feet, the tempo of the game changed. Even against children older than himself, he competed with remarkable confidence and ease. Those who watched him couldn't believe that someone so young possessed such an advanced understanding of the game. Unfortunately, in the world of football, talent alone is not always enough, because the clubs had another question they needed to answer. Who was going to pay for this boy's treatment? From that moment on, every hope revolved around that single question. As a father, Jorge Messi believed in his son's talent with all his heart. But for the clubs, the issue wasn't just football. They were looking at years of expensive medical treatment, and taking on that financial responsibility was a major risk. Many conversations began with hope, but most of those same conversations ended in disappointment. Every rejection placed an even heavier burden on Jorge Messi's shoulders. Even so, he refused to give up, because turning back was no longer an option. From an early age, the talented young boy continued to impress everyone while playing for clubs in Rosario. But no matter how well he performed, the biggest obstacle never changed. The cost of his growth hormone treatment was far beyond what the family could afford. Jorge Messi searched desperately for a solution in Argentina. He knocked on doors, held meetings, and tried to find a club willing to give his son a chance. But as time went on, it became increasingly clear that the solution was not in Argentina. That was when all hope turned toward Spain, thousands of miles away. Jorge Messi did everything he could to reach the football officials at Barcelona. After days of waiting, the answer he had been hoping for finally arrived. Barcelona wanted to see the young boy with their own eyes. It wasn't a transfer offer. It was simply one opportunity. Perhaps the one opportunity that could change their lives forever. Jorge Messi understood just how significant that opportunity was, because the invitation was nothing more than a short trial period. No one had promised his son anything. Barcelona simply wanted to find out whether everything they had heard about the boy was true. So father and son set off on the most important journey of their lives. When they left Argentina and arrived in Spain, they had no idea what was waiting for them. Perhaps they would return home just a few days later. Or perhaps this journey would become the beginning of the dream they had chased for so many years. When the long-awaited day finally arrived, the young boy stepped onto Barcelona's training ground. The coaches and club officials watched him closely. During the first few minutes, no one said a word, because true talent rarely needs to introduce itself. Every time the ball reached his feet, he glided past defenders with ease, made decisions far beyond his years, and read the game as if he had been playing at that level for a lifetime. As the minutes passed, the expressions on the faces of the officials standing on the sidelines began to change. The boy they were watching was nothing like an ordinary academy player. And it wasn't just his technical ability that left them amazed. His football intelligence, composure, and confidence at such a young age also stood out. But there was still one major problem that had to be solved. Yes, Barcelona had seen the talent, but they also knew about the boy's medical condition. Now the club had one crucial decision to make. Were they willing to take on years of expensive medical treatment for a child with extraordinary potential? It was at that very moment that Barcelona's sporting director, Karl Rexach, made his decision. What he saw was not just a talented young boy. He saw extraordinary potential, someone who, if given the right support, could one day change the future of world football. But time was working against them. The club's official procedures could take weeks, perhaps even months. Jorge Messi couldn't afford to wait that long. He had traveled to Spain with his family, and with each passing day, the uncertainty grew. That is why Karl Rexach made an extraordinary decision. He didn't have an official contract with him, but he also didn't want to lose this opportunity. According to the famous story, he picked up a paper napkin that was lying on the table and wrote a handwritten commitment, stating that the young boy would join the club. Perhaps no one present that day could have imagined that this ordinary-looking napkin would later become one of the most famous documents in football history. But Jorge Messi saw far more than a few handwritten lines. Those words marked the end of months of uncertainty. Every door he had knocked on, every rejection he had endured, every exhausting shift at the steel factory, every anxious moment spent in hospital corridors. It all seemed to lead to that single moment. But this wasn't the end of the journey. In many ways, it was only the beginning, because Barcelona's greatest promise wasn't simply to bring the young boy into their academy. The club also agreed to cover the cost of his growth hormone treatment. For the first time in years, the greatest obstacle Jorge Messi had been fighting was finally beginning to disappear. That day, Barcelona didn't just sign a young footballer. Without realizing it, they also removed the biggest obstacle standing in the way of one of football's greatest legends. And perhaps the most fascinating question of all is this: if Jorge Messi had given up that day, if he had simply accepted fate, what do you think would have happened? Perhaps we'll never know the true answer. Maybe he still would have become a great footballer. Maybe he would have chosen an entirely different path in life. Or perhaps we would never have heard his name at all. But one thing is certain: sometimes people's lives are shaped not only by their talent, but by the decisions made by those who believe in them. And Jorge Messi's decision changed far more than just his son's future. It opened the door to an era that millions of football fans would never forget. The years passed. The little boy grew up. He continued to develop inside Barcelona's academy with every passing season. As he progressed through the club's youth ranks, it became increasingly clear why those who had watched him years earlier in Argentina had been so amazed. His talent was no longer a secret known only to his family and coaches. His name was being spoken more and more throughout the corridors of Barcelona. But for Jorge Messi, something else mattered even more. His son was getting healthier. Thanks to regular growth hormone treatment, his physical development improved steadily, and the greatest obstacle they had faced for so many years slowly began to disappear. Perhaps it was during those moments that Jorge Messi was finally able to breathe with relief, because he could finally see that years of sacrifice had not been in vain. Yet no one could have imagined that this quiet and humble father would one day be remembered as the unseen hero. Behind the trophies lifted in the world's greatest stadiums, the world applauded the star on the pitch. But behind that shining star stood a father who had fought every battle in the shadows. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story leaves us with. The people who change history are not always the ones whose names appear in the headlines. Sometimes, the person who changes everything is simply an ordinary father who never gives up on his child's dream. Behind the world's greatest legends, there are often people whose names almost no one knows. And that is exactly whose stories we tell on this channel. If you want to discover the untold family stories, sacrifices, and unseen heroes who changed the course of football history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video.